brings that into focus in a really accessible, approachable, kind of subtle way. Welcome, come on in.
Hi.
There's some seats over here.
Thank you.
So yeah, it's interesting coming to, give a talk. Welcome. I'm Keenan, and growing up, my dad, he used to work in is called the California Conservation Corps. So it was a state-run program for young people to get them working, mostly like outside. Come on in. There's some chairs over here. And there were work camps in different parts of California where people would go and live. There were residential programs. So he would manage camps and do trainings and staff stuff and work with the Corps members, as they were called. And he was kind of famous for giving talks. And that's one of my standout memories of him was giving a talk to them. And they're like 18 to 22-ish year olds and very diverse backgrounds. But he would give these kind of out there talks, and he would talk about one time I remember, and I used to be a little bit scared going there, just being around like 20-somethings or teenagers. Hi, Eric. Welcome. It used to be a little bit intimidating going there because I didn't know the Corps members, but he would give sort of like commencement addresses when they'd finish up time there or just for occasions. And one of the times he spoke about, if we were to think about all that we've done together, but then he spoke about, the distance that we've traveled together. So if you were to take into account how much the Earth has rotated since we've spent time together, as well as, progressing around the sun, and he had this astronomical big long number that we could say, hey, we've traveled this far together. And even right now, if you were to think big picture, if you were standing far outside of the galaxy and looking down on us, we are traveling together right now, even though it kind of feels very much that we're still. It's interesting being here, and it's another thing also I think worth mentioning. In my 7th grade class right now, we were talking about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and what in history has sort of fallen away or died and what has been reborn. And a lot of them, I had them write a paragraph and think about where else do they see that in life. And a lot of them have been talking about COVID, and they were, 2nd grade, I think, when COVID happened. And just what a treat it is to be able to be in a room talking together in person. I was reminded of that when they were mentioning these very real things in their writing. But to be able to be here and to be able to share that, I think, is still important. That we're not Zooming right now. We're in a room together at the same time and listening to each other's voice, which I think brings out a lot of humanity, just kind of hearing somebody's voice. We're just very lucky to be moving together and be in the same space. It's interesting. I'm watching my dad currently lose the ability to speak. He has dementia, and just how much of your humanity is wrapped up in your voice and being able to use that and relate and communicate with the world. And then to not have that is really interesting because he was really known for speeches, And so here he is not having all of the control over his life that he once had. But he was the one that was very interested in reading weird books as well as giving weird talks. And I came later to find out that those weird books that he was reading were about spiritual science and things that Rudolf Steiner had written about the philosophy of the spiritual world, basically. And he never really shared that with us, and I was never in a Waldorf school or a place where there was other Waldorf-y things happening. But that was just kind of his own interest and his own reading that he, even today, where he's not capable of reading, he still just like holds those books, and for him, that's his comfort, is just to have those books with him. That brings him a lot of peace. But he heard about Anthroposphic when he was a young hippie in Santa Barbara in the 70s, where he met my mom. They were in some kind of communal living situation where they were shoveling compost for the community garden, and they met there. But at one point, he was driving an old beat-up pickup truck around with his buddy. Hi, welcome. Come on in. There's a few chairs over here. Oh, Charlie. But yeah, he was driving an old beat-up truck with his friend around, and this little guy who was probably about this tall, wearing spats. He was an Austrian guy, and he grabbed my dad by the arm and said, "Hey, we need to study some things together." And it turns out that previously he had found a hand-carved wooden sign that he thought looked kind of cool, and they hung it on their truck, and it said biodynamic farming, which he had no idea what that meant. But this little Austrian guy did, and he knew, he was really into reading about the way that the planets can inform how you homeopathically work with the soil and what is known as biodynamic farming, which was another initiative that Rudolf Steiner started a long time ago. So anyways, that got him into those reading books, which kind of got him into giving these sort of out there speeches, which he wasn't talking about those things to the core members when he was running the work camps, but he was known for that. And then when I finished college, he's like, "Oh, you should go check out these schools." And so then I ended up going to England to study to be a Waldorf teacher, and here I am. So these little things, just kind of, these little destiny moments can kind of lead us along the way. And fast forward to a few years back, I had taught Macy and Grayson's class for 8 years, and it was probably right around now, because this is usually the time when teachers have to kind of start thinking about what their intentions are for the following year, and it's a letter you write to the school. And it's not random that it is this time of year, because there's something about this time of year where we start to think about what's coming in the future. And as I was approaching the end of that, and I don't know if it was 7th or, no, it was 8th grade, Ben Reynolds, your former teacher, said, "Hey, next year you should go live in my house in Chile. That's down there." And my wife and I had a 3 and a 6-year-old at the time, Esme and Lyra, and we kind of thought that sounded crazy, but then we were like, "Yeah, let's do that. Let's take a year and just go live down there, and maybe our girls will learn some Spanish." And so we packed up our house, put everything in the garage, closed it shut, and took 3 planes, and eventually made our way to Chile. And we left here in late June, so it was hot, and we got there, and it was the middle of winter, and because it's in the southern hemisphere, and it was so cold, and it just rained and rained and rained, and we had this like everybody has the corrugated iron or metal roofs, and it was so loud you couldn't hardly hear each other talk, and it was so cold, and we only had a wood stove to heat the house that we were renting, and somebody dropped off a load of firewood that we had prearranged, and it was starting to rain, and I was like rushing outside to throw a tarp over the wood so that our only heat source would not be totally soaking wet. But then we had this beautiful experience of not quite living in Ben's old house, but his house became a kindergarten that our kids went to, and it's this big straw bale house that he made down there and raised his 2 boys in. And they would go there for kindergarten, and they didn't have a playground, but they would just, they'd put their reindeer on every day, and they'd go to a field nearby and play in the mud and get totally soaked and come back and dry off. I mean, it rained like 70 inches a year down there. And we had Christmas on the beach, barbecuing because it was the middle of summer, and our kids learned some Spanish, which they've forgotten most of, but those seeds are still there. But it was a really beautiful experience and a big one for us. And then coming back, Ben and I enjoyed playing music together. We would go to classes at Swallow Hill and take classes together. And then when we got together, we would just play. He'd play the guitar and I'd play the mandolin, and we'd just pick fiddle tunes, and that's how we sort of hung out and connected, and it was really nice. And then for 15 years, he had this dream of being a farmer. So for a long, long, long time. And knowing Ben, he's just like a farmer through and through. Even when he was here as a teacher, like he was a farmer. And it finally worked out for him and his wife, Heidi, and their sons kind of in and out, to go be a farmer at what's called a Camp Hill village. And so our family this summer went to go visit him, and we flew out to upstate New York, where it's called Camp Hill Village, where it's a community that there are, I think, over 100 of these communities throughout the world, and then in 20 different countries. There's a handful of these communities in the U.S. where people with different cognitive or physical different abilities or disabilities, as well as other workers, all live together in communal houses, and there's farming that happens and workshops for the people who live there, and they grow a lot of their own food. And we got there, and in the morning, we would wake up at 6 o'clock or so, and Esme, my daughter, who was 8 at the time in the summer, she begged me to go with her, or to come with me to go milk the cows in the morning, and they're still milking cows by hand. They have their herd, and people with all kinds of abilities are there working with the cows, and you go in, and it's like warm and musty, and the smell is really strong, and you have to like silent up next to these giant animals that at first you're kind of wondering, like, are they going to step on me? Are they going to kick me? They have poo on them. It's really sort of this strangely intimate thing, if you've ever done it before, and you're there on the little stool, and it's really awkward, but you milk this pail, a few gallons or whatever it is, and then after all of them are milked, then you walk them out to pasture with like just this group of people, like probably 10 or 12 of us, all kinds of different people, from the head farmer down to the guy who just the only job that he does is take a little kind of chisel and goes along at the plastered walls or the lime walls and like chip off pieces of cow dung that are on the wall, and that's what he does for hours. And he comes out with us, and you get your little stick, and you walk, and he has this whip. They all have this way, like, up, come on, up, and you kind of just wave your stick in the air, and it's just this big, slow-moving train. And there was one point where the cows had to turn into the pasture that we were taking them, so we took them up a road and into this field. And my daughter Esme was there with her little stick to kind of like turn them in, and they were coming. And in biodynamic farming, you keep the horns on the cows. You don't take them off because it's part of what connects them to nature in important and unique ways. So there are these giant cows coming towards her with their big horns, and she's just like ushering them in, like cool as you like. And then afterwards, we go to farmer's breakfast, where we all sit around the table, all the farmers, and just have a very simple breakfast, like oatmeal and cheese and milk and whatever else. And the head farmer, afterwards, he was like, I'm really impressed that Esme was not afraid of those cows. And that was just like, the best moment ever. But yeah, they lived in these communal houses where the residents and the family members, I guess they call them, they would come together at night and say a verse and say what they were grateful for. Ben and Heidi are really good at bringing traditions and rhythm and intentional ways of being that's kind of almost like ceremony, I guess you could say. They're really, really good at that. But their house was really beautiful and also scary at times, people needing help bathing, folks that might start like hitting themselves, and Heidi would calm them down in this really beautiful, gentle way, or saying things, or screaming at times, or just being like the sweetest, kindest, most loving person you could imagine, and would kind of just sidle up next to you. And it was a really beautiful way of all of them living together in this place that was, like if you want meat, then once a week you would go to the shop where they would butcher their own meat. If you want cheese, Ben would go around to your house and deliver cheese, and you get your milk from the cows. They would grow their vegetables, and so everything was very local, and they had all these workshops like saving seeds, and so people would be mailing seeds that they would save, these heirloom variety of seeds, and mail it out all over the country, or they would go to candle making workshops during the day, or woodworking shops and classes and things. But everybody living together in these really beautiful ways. The reason I wanted to talk about Camp Hill too is because the founder of Camp Hill's, Carl Koenig, he found his destiny, his calling to be the founder of these kind of communities when he attended his first winter spiral. I wanted to just also share, I printed off a picture of Carl Koenig, and then on the back, you can read later, but there's a little blurb that's the back of a calendar, but talks about one of the Camp Hills in the United States, to just kind of get a sense of kind of what they are. But if you think about his destiny starting these Camp Hills and how many people that has rippled out over the years since the 40s, I believe many, many people have been deeply impacted by these communities. And so, it has this rippling out effect. But I want to share a little picture of him. You can have these just to see, because I want to talk a little bit about Carl Koenig and his life and how he went to his first winter spiral and sort of the impact that he had. Just to see a picture of him, and then on the back too, you can kind of look. So Carl Koenig was born in 1902 in Vienna to Jewish parents. His father was a rabbi who came from sort of like royal family lineage, or was connected in some small way to the monarchy in Austria and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He didn't have any siblings. His dad was a very kind of serious and somewhat stern figure. And his dad, Karl Koenig's grandfather, moved to Vienna because, who was also a rabbi. No, I'm sorry, only his grandfather was a rabbi. His father was not. But his grandfather, who was a rabbi, slipped on a bridge on the ice and became paraplegic and needed to move the family to Vienna to get medical treatment, which never really helped him, and he spent, I think, 18 years in bed and not able to move around and do things. And his father eventually was an apprentice to a shoemaker and then had his own shoe shop, which he owned until the Hitler occupation in Vienna, where in the pogroms the shop was plundered and taken away. His mom was, Bertha was her name. She grew up in more like impoverished conditions and not coming from this kind of monarchy background and not strictly Jewish in that she just went to sort of the main festivals and not strictly observing. So as I said, they lost their shoe shop, and the parents and the family was detained for 3 weeks. Eventually, they were able to kind of like bargain and get some help from friends to be able to get their freedom. And they got a permit to go to England, where eventually they connected with a community in Scotland called Camp Hill, which is where the name comes from for these communities that he founded. But all of the siblings of his father, 3 sisters and a brother, died in concentration camps. His mother ended up eventually going to an old kind of elderly care facility. His dad died when he was 90 years old. But yeah, Karl grew up being in a very like solitary kind of world. He was a very short person, very, very short, large-headed and very, very short. His feet were somehow angled in a direction where he needed corrective braces, so he wasn't able to move about very freely, and it was hard for him. Like every little step was sort of an act of will, or very, very intentional. Though it was said that, his walk was very intentional, but it also kind of appeared as if he was floating. And one person described seeing him as a young child being pushed around in a stroller, like a kind of a king in a chariot. But that meant that he was often very dependent on others, kind of to an extreme degree. And later on, when he had colleagues in medical school, there was a quote of some of them saying, we are his limbs and he makes use of us, meaning like he puts us to work and he's kind of used to that. He was very, very intellectually curious, and at a young age he was able to read Hebrew. He was reading before he went to school, and he was reading very serious things like Goethe's Faust when he was a teenager. He would sometimes read entire plays like Sophocles in one sitting. He just read and read and read. And if you could imagine being kind of solitary, this was his world. He was very advanced compared to his peers intellectually, so it kind of made social life really hard for him. But yeah, he was interested. Faith for him changed as he grew, because he grew up in the Jewish faith, but at 13, he had his bar mitzvah, but he started to be less and less connected to the Jewish faith. And one time before that, he went with his nanny to a Catholic service, and it was on Easter Sunday, and they brought down the crucifixion and put it into an altar that was hard to see. And as a 5-year-old, he went up to the altar and said, like, "Hey, I want to look in there." And they said, "No, only priests can look in here." And his response was basically, "Well, I'll become a priest then." And he went home and told that to his parents, and his parents laughed at him. And he said, "Okay, then I'll become a rabbi." You can see like his strong will forces. At a certain point, he had hidden in his room a picture of Jesus, which was kind of something that he kept very private and secret. At 12 years old, that was when the First World War was happening around him, and his family was fairly well off. Like, they had everything they needed. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't hurting for money. But he refused to wear new clothes because he saw so much poverty around him, so much starvation, so much inflation. Lots of people did not have what they needed, and so he refused to wear new clothes. There's a story of him coming back from a cold winter day without his overcoat, and people in the shop where his parents worked were like, "Why do you let your child go out without a coat?" And he said, "Well, I saw another boy who was cold, and so I gave him my coat." And these were war times, so it was very, very serious. But he, would wear secondhand clothes. He would wear underwear that was like considered giveaway underwear. He saw a lot of misery around him, and he had a hard time. He had migraines and would spend days in bed. At 14, he started to become interested in different political things that were happening around him, socialist ideals, but a memory that really stood out to him was the death of and the burial of the monarchy that was there. So Kaiser Franz Joseph, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, so when he was buried, it was in all of this pomp and circumstance, horses with giant regalia, and it was a bitter cold day, and all of the people came out to see the coffin being processed, and it brought up all this uncertainty about, like, when we go home from this, will we have food? Will there be the things? Will the world be the way we knew it was before this? And this event was like very profound him and for a lot of people. So this image of stability and power and wealth was no more, and things really shifted. That really stood out to him. But he continued to be very intellectually curious and would read ancient Greek philosophy from Ephesus. As a high school student, he would just spend days thinking and observing his thoughts. He wanted to enter into the cognitive process, is what he wrote in his diary. This is a high school student being very, very wrapped up in how does thinking work and what are the limits of sense perceptions. So these are things he was interested in at a very young age. He was close to his parents right up to their death, and eventually he wanted to become a doctor. And he began to kind of move away from like a religious life and became more interested in seeing God in nature and all around him. And he took that into becoming a doctor. And later in life, he gave a lot of lectures to find and connect the stages of development in embryology to spiritual ideals. But at this time, as a young student, he wanted to find out the laws of nature. He also was still very reverent in a lot of ways. He wanted to become aware, he wrote, of the errors of materialistic interpretation of nature. So he wanted to dive into science and the material world, but also still is interested in what was behind that. He was a very creative person, and with that, when he felt like his creativity had dried up, he had very sorrowful thoughts, even moments of contemplating suicide, and felt very, very deeply. He wrote a lot of poems as well. So he was a very creative person. He went to his university years to Vienna, and he wrote in his diary that the sea of materialism will rush in upon me, but I shall stand fast. The world and the universe are full of angels and wonders, full of goodness and anger, and full of will forces. He felt very, very deeply about things, but still wanted to find out what was happening around him. Eventually, as a student, he, in Vienna, was responsible to be a welcoming party for this doctor that was coming to visit. The doctor is this woman named Dr. Wegman, who was a doctor very closely related to Rudolf Steiner, and was going to Rudolf Steiner's sister's funeral. And he was in charge of welcoming her with a couple other people, and he recalls standing on the train platform, waiting and thinking, I'm a shy, introverted person. Why am I here? Why do I have to welcome this person? What am I doing here? Eventually she comes off the train and welcomes him, and they shake hands, and he said all of that went away, and instantly he felt very, very at ease around her. Not long after that, she asked him a few questions about his life and said, you should come to Arlesheim and work in my clinic with me. And he said, but I have a couple more months left of my internship for what I'm doing with my medical studies here in Vienna. And she said, come in 2 weeks. And so she was a very forceful personality, and he came in a couple weeks to go work with her. He started out in the lab and eventually became a doctor for children who had developmental and different kind of cognitive differences. And she said, this is what you should do. Will you come work in this facility that has these people? And he recalled the only other time he had any experience with somebody with different abilities was at his house. There used to be a family friend who had a son who would visit, and this person couldn't speak and couldn't hear. And he recalls that he felt what he wrote as a childish sorrow being in this person's presence. So not like, oh, this is it, this is easy. He felt a childish sorrow, he said. He recalls another time he went on a walk with another person who had intellectual disabilities, and this person really wanted to be friendly with him. And he wrote that his heart was closed to that person at that time, meaning like he wasn't ready to be friends with this person. And those were the only two kind of personal encounters he had with any of these folks, and they weren't easy, which is, I think, quite real and honest. But then when he came to this facility, this clinic where he was going to be a doctor for these children, he just observed them in their joys and their sorrows and their laughters and just marveled at their humanity. And to him, that started to become really, really touching and really, really important. And their light and their humanity really changed him, and he began to love that work. And then at Advent, there was what was it called? Yeah, there was just a little Advent hill with a light at nearby. And in the facility, they had the biggest room, and they made a little mound, and they had made out of moss a little spiral, and in the middle was a large candle. And the children, with the help of somebody or on their own, would go, and they had a candle and an apple, which was connected to the imagery around the fall, and kind of being cast out of the Garden of Eden. They would go and light this candle, and they were singing songs. And he saw the way that the children would go and light the candles, and he was so moved by it, he was in tears. And at that moment, that's when he realized, this is my calling, this is my destiny, this is what I'm going to do. And eventually, he started these Camp Hill communities. And so that rippled out to many, many communities. And if you think of each community, how many children and how many people that has impacted in their destinies, it's this huge rippling out effect that he went on to have. And it was really in that moment of being in the Advent spiral or the winter spiral that he really, it became clear to him what his destiny was. And so we do these spirals, not for everybody to find their destiny, but it is this little moment of, in the midst of winter when things are very dark, to kind of have this imagery of going inward and finding that your light inside. I tell the students it's a good time to think about what are your intentions for the year. So we carry that into the darkness. We light that candle in the middle, and then we place it on the path out. And it's a beautiful picture of community, whereby the end of a group of people walking, you have this whole lit path out. So spiraling in and spiraling out into more of a community space, I think is a really profound experience where it can be a little quiet, sacred space to kind of sit with one's destiny and to carry intentions into the future. And it's just a really beautiful moment when you watch your students, when I watch my students walk the spiral. You can really glean a lot by watching the way they walk, because it is said that the way that one walks is a picture of the manifestation of their spiritual destiny meeting the earth. So quite literally, the way we meet the earth in our walk is also a picture of us and our own journeys coming from the spiritual world and being on the earth and being here. So you see that, and some students go in and they're like marching with their heels loud on the ground. Some kind of get lost and aren't sure where to go. Some are really quiet and reverent, and I think, like you said, it's a really touching time to just observe. And not that we can make direct correlations about what is or isn't going to happen, but it's a really sacred, beautiful space. So yeah, Carl Koenig, I think his life is really interesting to have been able to meet his destiny in this kind of moment, and very few of us have that sort of clarity in that, but it is an open space for us to kind of carry something in and to be coming out in this communal sort of gesture of light. So, yeah, thank you. Whenever you're ready, do you need to say anything, or? I think people know, yeah, we'll figure it out when we go there. But if you'd like to walk it, I really warmly invite you to. It's a really great time. You can stay.